Chris Benoit was on top of the world in 2007, one of the greatest professional wrestlers to ever step into the ring, admired by fans worldwide for his unmatched skill and determination. He had it all: fame, fortune, and a seemingly perfect family with his wife, Nancy, and their young son, Daniel. To the outside world, the Benoit family was the epitome of happiness and success. But everything came crashing down in a matter of days, transforming their home into a nightmare that would haunt the wrestling world forever. What happened inside that house will shock you, and the truth behind the tragedy is far darker than anyone could have ever imagined. The details surrounding the events of that weekend have left investigators and the public alike searching for answers. Despite extensive coverage and investigation, the true motive behind the horrific crime remains unclear. What is known is that, by the end of that fateful weekend, every member of the Benoit family, Chris, his wife Nancy, and their 7-year-old son Daniel, had tragically lost their lives. This case has been the subject of countless documentaries, podcasts, and articles, yet it remains one of the most requested topics for exploration. The mystery surrounding the events of that weekend continues to intrigue, shock, and sadden fans around the world. At the time of the tragedy, Chris Benoit was just 40 years old. Born in Montreal in 1967, Chris was raised in Alberta, Canada, and spent most of his early life there. As a young boy, he was not particularly different from other children. But one thing set him apart: his unwavering passion for professional wrestling. By the time he was 12 years old, Chris had already started training and lifting weights with the goal of becoming a professional wrestler. This obsession would shape the rest of his life. Chris's father, Michael Benoit, described his son as an extremely focused and dedicated child, often consumed by his love of wrestling. While other kids his age played outside or participated in typical childhood activities, Chris spent most of his time studying wrestling, learning its techniques, and working to hone his skills. Two of his biggest inspirations were Tom Billington, better known as the Dynamite Kid, and Bret the Hitman Hart. Chris modeled much of his early training after these two legendary wrestlers, and as he entered the professional wrestling world, he even adopted Bret Hart's finishing move, the sharpshooter, a move that would become iconic in the wrestling world. By the early 1990s, Chris was fully dedicated to his wrestling career, and his hard work was beginning to pay off. He quickly earned a reputation as a technically skilled wrestler with a relentless drive, both in and out of the ring. This commitment to his career likely played a role in his personal life as well, particularly in his relationship with his first wife, Martina. The couple married in the late 1980s and had 2 children, a son, David, and a daughter, Megan. However, by 1997, their marriage began to unravel. While the specifics remain unclear, it seems that Chris and Martina drifted apart, and eventually, Chris was involved in a scandal that would change the course of his life. In a turn of events that shocked both the wrestling world and his personal life, Chris was found in bed with Nancy Sullivan, the wife of fellow wrestler Keith Sullivan. This affair led to both Chris and Nancy divorcing their spouses, and their relationship soon blossomed. By 2000, Chris and Nancy married, and shortly afterward, Nancy announced she was pregnant with their son, Daniel. Their new family seemed to offer Chris a fresh start, but as history would show, their relationship was far from perfect. By 2003, cracks began to appear in Chris and Nancy's marriage. Nancy filed for divorce and even sought a restraining order against Chris, citing violent outbursts and property damage during arguments. Surprisingly, the divorce was called off, and the restraining order was dropped, suggesting that the couple had reconciled. However, this turbulence in their personal life was only one part of the story. Despite these challenges, Chris's career in wrestling continued to flourish. He became one of the most respected and accomplished wrestlers in the industry, a constant presence in major promotions, and a fan favorite for his in-ring performances. While Chris's wrestling achievements were monumental, it is important to note that behind his professional success, he was battling personal demons that would eventually have a devastating impact. He had earned a reputation as a top performer, and for many years, he seemed to be living the dream. But there was another side to Chris that many fans were unaware of: the struggles he faced with his mental health, particularly as his wrestling career took a toll on his body and mind. In his early years, Chris Benoit's issues with mental health and personal well-being did not seem to affect his performance. However, as time went on and his career progressed, the physical and emotional toll of years of grueling wrestling matches began to take its toll. Chris, known for his extreme dedication and willingness to push his body to the limit, had sustained numerous concussions throughout his career. In fact, he had suffered from at least 30 documented concussions, but the true number was likely much higher. These repeated head injuries were never fully understood at the time, and the long-term effects of multiple concussions were not as widely recognized as they are today. Over time, Chris began to show signs of mental decline. He struggled with mood swings, severe emotional outbursts, and increasingly erratic behavior. As he aged, these symptoms worsened, and it became clear that Chris was no longer the same person he had been in his earlier years. His mental health deteriorated, and the pressure of maintaining his career while dealing with these personal struggles became too much to bear. As Chris's wrestling career continued to rise, so did the strain on his personal life. By the time of the tragedy in 2007, it was clear that Chris was carrying a heavy burden. Though he was beloved by his fans for his incredible performances, behind closed doors, he was grappling with issues that no one, not even his closest friends, could have fully understood. Chris Benoit's story is one of both triumph and tragedy. He was a man who had everything going for him: an incredible career, a family that loved him, and a world that admired his talents. But beneath the surface, he was silently battling personal demons that ultimately led to a tragic and inexplicable ending. His story serves as a reminder of the dangers of ignoring the mental and physical toll that professional wrestling and other physically demanding careers can have on the human body and mind. While Chris Benoit's legacy as a wrestler remains intact, the events of that fateful weekend in 2007 cast a long shadow over his career and reputation. Investigators may never fully understand what led to the tragic loss of his family, but what is clear is that Chris Benoit was not only a victim of his own actions, but also of a system that failed to recognize the long-term consequences of repeated concussions and brain trauma. The crime. June 24, 2007. On June 24, 2007, the Benoit family's world would come to a devastating and infamous end. For the rest of the world, it was just another regular day, but for Chris and his family, it marked the beginning of something horrifically wrong. Leading up to the crime, there were no signs of trouble. The Benoit family was carrying on with their usual routines. Chris's son was on summer break, and Nancy was going about her day. Chris maintained his regular training schedule, but for reasons that remain unclear, June 24th would become the day that Chris snapped. The day before the tragedy, Chris left a voicemail for his friend Chavo, saying that both Nancy and Daniel had food poisoning, and that he would be late for the night's show in Beaumont, Texas. When Chavo returned the call, he found Chris sounding exhausted and groggy, as though he had just woken up, even though it was already the afternoon. Chavo tried to brush it off, but felt something was off. He called back a few minutes later, and Chris answered, apologizing and explaining that he had been on the phone with Delta Airlines about changing his flight plans, and again mentioning his family's food poisoning. Chavo, still uneasy, said, "If you need to talk, I'm here for you." Chris responded, "Chavo, I love you," and hung up. Chris didn't show up for his flight or for his scheduled match that evening, which was highly unusual. This was a man who wouldn't have missed a match for anything, so his absence raised concern. He then mentioned rescheduling the match because of his family's illness. On June 24th, Chris missed yet another scheduled flight. Early that morning, before 4 a.m., he sent strange text messages to several colleagues. The messages included his home address, a note about the family dogs being in the backyard near the pool, and the garage door being left open. The texts confused the recipients, but no one knew what to make of them. Chavo, who had been woken by the texts, went back to sleep, assuming everything was fine and expecting to meet Chris later that day. However, Chris never showed up. By the time of a major wrestling event scheduled in Corpus Christi the next day, Chris still hadn't appeared. His absence was noted, and as the day wore on, worry turned into fear. When it became clear that Chris had been unreachable for 2 days, friends and colleagues decided to contact the police for a welfare check. By 4:15 p.m. that afternoon, Fayetteville, Georgia police had conducted a welfare check at the Benoit residence. Unfortunately, the news was grim. Chris, his wife, and his son were all found dead. When police arrived at the Benoit home, they immediately identified it as a major crime scene. At first, the details of the crime were confusing, as investigators couldn't figure out who could have committed such a violent act. They discovered that Nancy had been restrained before her death, with her hands bound using a TV cable and her feet taped together. As they continued to search for more evidence, they found a sock in the trash, covered with dried biological fluids, which suggested it had been used to gag her. Things grew even more disturbing when they discovered Chris's young son, Daniel, lying lifeless in his bed. Shortly after, Chris was found in the family's workout room, where he had a piece of gym equipment. This helped investigators piece together the events, as it appeared that Chris had taken his own life after the murders. A few days later, Chris's first wife received a package containing some of his belongings, including a Bible with a note inside. Though the full content of the note has not been disclosed, investigators revealed one key detail. Chris had witnessed the killings of his family, and he knew exactly who the killer was. It was himself. The motive. One of the most haunting aspects of the tragic deaths of Chris Benoit, his wife Nancy, and their son Daniel, is the lack of a clear motive. Despite the brutal nature of the crime, no obvious reason for the killings seemed to surface at first. Chris Benoit appeared to have everything anyone could ask for: a successful wrestling career, a wife he loved, and a son he adored. So, why would he commit such a violent and senseless act? This question would linger in the minds of investigators, his friends, and fans alike, with no easy answers to explain the horror. At the crime scene, one of the most striking details was the presence of a Bible placed next to each family member. This simple yet significant act suggested that Chris may have been experiencing some form of remorse for his actions, or perhaps he was trying to ensure that his family would find peace in the afterlife. While it was clear that the Benoit family held some level of religious belief, the specifics of their faith remain unclear. There is little information available to confirm whether they were actively attending church services or how religious they truly were, but it was evident that they did their best as a family to uphold values that may have been rooted in faith. Yet, despite the religious imagery at the scene, one major question remains. Why? What could have driven Chris Benoit to murder his wife and son before taking his own life? Detectives noted the absence of a clear motive. There was no financial distress, no history of violent crime, and no obvious reason for Chris to snap. Investigators could not find any direct triggers for the tragic event, which left them with a sense of confusion and disbelief. Chris seemed to have everything: a loving family, financial security, and a successful career. What led to such an inexplicable crime? As detectives combed through the evidence, a theory began to emerge. Reports surfaced suggesting that Chris Benoit had been experiencing episodes of roid rage, a condition associated with the abuse of steroids. The effects of steroid abuse can lead to emotional instability, irrational anger, and violent outbursts. It was speculated that Chris might have acted out of anger during one of these episodes, potentially driven by the effects of steroids on his body and mind. But even this theory, though plausible, did not fully explain why Chris would target his own family, or why he would ultimately take his own life afterward. As a result, investigators decided to pursue further avenues of inquiry, including an examination of Chris Benoit's brain. Chris's father, Michael Benoit, agreed to have his son's brain tested, hoping to gain some insight into what might have caused such a violent breakdown. The results were both shocking and tragic. Upon conducting a thorough analysis, neurosurgeons discovered that Chris had severe and widespread damage across all 4 lobes of his brain, as well as noticeable damage to his brainstem. The findings were startling. Chris's brain resembled that of an elderly person suffering from Alzheimer's disease, despite Chris being only 40 years old at the time of his death. The damage was extensive, with significant deterioration of the brain tissue in areas responsible for mood regulation, decision-making, and impulse control. The neurosurgeon concluded that the damage to Chris's brain was likely the result of years of repeated head trauma, much of it sustained during his wrestling career. Chris was known for his willingness to take extreme risks in the ring, and his career had been built on performing stunts that involved high-impact moves, many of which led to significant head injuries. One of Chris's close friends, a former professional wrestler, recalled how Chris would regularly allow himself to be struck in the head with a steel chair, an act that Chris himself later referred to as stupid. It was estimated that Chris had suffered at least 30 documented concussions throughout his career, though many more likely went unreported. The cumulative impact of these injuries had a profound effect on Chris's mental health, but at the time, the dangers of repeated concussions were not widely understood. The science behind brain trauma and its long-term effects was still in its infancy, and Chris may not have been fully aware of the extent to which he was damaging his brain. In light of these findings, investigators came to a chilling conclusion. Chris Benoit was, in many ways, a victim as well. His wrestling career, which had brought him fame and fortune, also subjected him to a dangerous and often grueling regimen that ultimately took a toll on his health. The years of head injuries, combined with other factors such as emotional stress, likely contributed to the mental and emotional instability that led to the tragic events of June 2007. Chris may have been completely unaware of the damage that had been building up inside his own brain, and he may have been incapable of recognizing the severity of his actions as he carried them out. The damage to Chris's brain likely impaired his critical thinking abilities, making it difficult for him to process information or make rational decisions. According to experts, brain injuries can lead to a range of symptoms, including memory loss, confusion, and emotional outbursts. Chris's behavior may have been characterized by intense emotional swings and unpredictable actions, which would have made it harder for him to control his impulses. Investigators speculated that he may have been experiencing bouts of amnesia, unable to recall his actions or understand the full extent of what he had done. His mental state may have been so compromised that, at times, he might not have even recognized what he was doing as he spiraled into a state of erratic behavior. Ultimately, the devastating events that unfolded in the Benoit household seemed to have been the result of a perfect storm of physical and emotional factors. Years of physical trauma from his wrestling career, combined with emotional struggles and an apparent lack of self-awareness about the damage being done to his brain, led to Chris reaching a breaking point. Investigators and experts now believe that, in many ways, Chris was barely holding on to his sanity as he dealt with the mounting pressures in his life. By the time the tragedy occurred, he may have been unable to fully comprehend the actions he was taking, making it impossible for him to stop the chain of events that led to the loss of his family. This tragic case has left many people grappling with difficult questions about mental health, the long-term effects of head trauma, and the pressures faced by professional athletes. Was Chris Benoit a monster, as some have suggested, or was he a victim of his career and the unseen damage it inflicted on his brain? The answer remains elusive, but one thing is certain. The combination of physical, emotional, and psychological factors likely contributed to one of the darkest and most heartbreaking events in the history of professional wrestling. This raises an important question. Can Chris truly be held accountable for what he did? The immediate response might be, yes, he intentionally harmed his wife, which suggests he had the capacity to understand his actions. It's also possible to argue that Chris chose his career, one that put him in physical danger, thus indirectly placing his family at risk as well. However, there's no evidence to suggest that Chris understood the long-term effects of his career. All he knew was that he was performing in front of thousands of fans, portraying a tough persona. The idea that his career was causing severe brain damage wasn't widely understood at the time. Research into repeated concussions wasn't as advanced or acknowledged as it is today. So, was Chris a monster or a victim? I'm not ready to give my assessment, but you can give yours in the comments.